am Michelle Amazine. I am the director of the CRC, and I'm very happy to present to you Dr. Arunima Krishna today, who is an assistant professor of public relations in the Mass Comm Advertising and PR department. And she is going to be sharing with us her presentation on understanding public's perceptions of and responses to corporate misconduct. And she's going to tell you a little bit about her background as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amazine. All right. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. I know you're sort of a captive audience, but I'm still very happy that you're here, even if it's just for points. But I have to tell you, this is my first time in 19 months being in a room full of this many people. It is very weird, but it is also awesome. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for following all the protocols and just being safe and all of that good stuff. So thank you very much. As Professor Amazine mentioned, my name is Arunima Krishna, and I'm an assistant professor of public relations here at BUCOM, and I'm really happy to be talking about my research. If you've met any academic ever, they love to talk about their research, so I'm here to do that to you for an hour today. The topic of my presentation today is understanding public's perceptions of and responses to corporate misconduct, which is one of the two programs of research that I have been focusing on in my time here at BU. But before I jump into the research, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I've been here at BU since 2016 after I got my PhD and my master's at Purdue University. So that's a really nice shot of Purdue's campus. That's really the only good one I could get. I've also taught a bunch of courses here at COM. Right now I'm teaching CM 701, so hi everyone who are in 701 with me. I've also taught a bunch of undergrad classes as well as COM 101 for a few semesters. And before I came to Purdue to get my MA and my PhD, I was actually back home in India, which is where I'm from. And I worked for a large food company called Britannia Industries Limited. And I used to manage on-ground activations and new product launches for all of these products. So they're all primarily dairy-based products. If you've ever spent time in a dairy factory or a manufacturing facility that makes any kind of dairy products, don't go back because it stinks. Like literally, it smells really bad. But the products are awesome. All right. So let's talk about my research. My overarching research agenda focuses on understanding public perceptions of controversial social issues. And in my research, I think of controversial social issues in two broad categories or buckets, right? The first category of controversial social issues that I focus on are complex, intractable problems rooted in disputes related to science, science misinformation, and what is scientific knowledge and how we constitute it, right? That line of my research has examined anti-vaccine activism, climate change, antimicrobial resistance, misinformation, etc. And in fact, I have an ongoing project with Professor Amazine that examines how we can correct vaccine misinformation on Facebook, both related to the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, as well as the COVID-19 vaccine, which is very exciting and very depressing stuff, right? And if we have time today, at the end of this session, I can talk to you all about some of that research as well. If at any point you can't hear me, if I say something that's unclear, please raise your hand and let me know. I'll be more than happy to repeat anything that you want me to clarify. If you can't hear something that I'm saying all the way in the back, please do let me know. All right, so today though, what I'm going to be talking about is not this, but the other bucket, which contains a line of research that I've been focusing on that focuses on corporate misconduct and social issues that become exacerbated because of corporate misconduct. So that's what I'll be focusing on today, social issues rooted in questions of morality and social justice caused by corporate misconduct, often perpetrated by companies or organizations, right? So today I'll talk to you about 4 journal articles, 3 of which are published, and 1 is under review at the Journal of Public Relations Research, None of this means anything to you, but just know this is important. The first study I'll be talking to you all about today is part of a project that I worked on with my colleague, Dr. Sujin Kim, who is at the University of Technology, Sydney. And at the time we did this study was done in December 2016. Dr. Kim was at Singapore Management University, which obviously is in Singapore, right? And we were able to get funding for this particular project from the Ministry of Education in Singapore to do this research. And in this study, we wanted to examine how customers, which are an important public for an organization or a corporation, how customers react and respond when their favorite companies are accused of gender discrimination in the workplace, right? So now we conducted this study in December 2016, which was actually quite serendipitous because in February 2017, just a few short months later, a blog by a former Uber employee launched quite a major conversation nationwide about gender discrimination in the workplace. And in that blog, that employee, her name was Susan Fowler, she talked about the systemic sexism and harassment that she had faced during her time at Uber, inspiring many other women to talk about their own stories, share their personal experiences, and it caused a lot of people to question the corporate culture at Uber, right? And it sort of gave new life to the hashtag delete Uber movement. Do you all remember that whole thing? Delete Uber, yeah. And so this whole situation gave new life to that movement, right? And so this is something that we wanted to understand even before it became a thing, right? Back in December 2016. So what exactly is gender discrimination? The EEO, or the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, defines it as treating someone, an applicant or employee, unfavorably because of that person's sex. As you may have guessed, gender discrimination is not new, right? In the workplace, several scholars have looked at a variety of issues surrounding gender discrimination, but most of these studies naturally tend to focus internally, tend to focus on how employees respond to such issues, to such allegations, to such inequities in the workplace, right? But now, as we saw particularly in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, consumers, customers, activists care more and more not just about corporations' actions facing outward, but also how they behave and treat their employees inward, right? So the line between internal and external is blurring so much that companies' actions internally have the potential to impact customers' perceptions and their relationships with the organization or the corporation. And so that's what we wanted to understand in this particular study. And so in this study, our objective was to understand how allegations of gender discrimination impact consumers' relationship with the brand in question. And we also wanted to understand individual level factors that impact customers' negative affective response to the allegations and eventually customer brand relationships. And so to do this, we drew upon something called equity theory to conceptualize the idea of perceived moral inequity of corporate behavior. So equity theory theorizes on how and why people are motivated to do their jobs well, right? And how and why people are motivated to do their jobs well depends on their perceptions of their inputs and how commensurate their outputs are, right? So how much effort you're putting in versus how much you're getting back from the organization or from your employers helps motivate you or demotivate you. That's part of equity theory. Another aspect of equity theory talks about how people judge their inputs and outputs in relation to others, right? In relation to other people's salary, compensation, how they are treated, etc., right? And so equity theory calls on businesses to reduce actual and perceived inequities between and among employees, as well as employees' input and output, right? In order to ensure that organizational functioning is optimized and is most effective. However, like I said earlier, as the lines between corporations' internal and external environments continue to blur, we also need to understand how internal factors, internal processes like, or internal systemic injustices like gender discrimination corporation's moral transgressions, and this is an example of a moral transgression, both ethical and social, these impact how external publics, especially consumers, feel about the organization. And so to capture public's cognitive responses to such allegations, to such transgressions, we conceptualized the idea of perceived moral inequity of corporate behavior, which we conceptually define as individuals' evaluations of behaviors or actions of a relational partner being unethical, unjust, or morally wrong. Right? So just sit with that for a second. Right? Perceived moral inequity refers to individuals' evaluations of behaviors or actions of a relational partner. I'm not specifying this to be corporations. It can be any relational partner. It could be your employees. It could be your employer. It could be your friend, family, your pet, right? It could be any relational partner with whom you perceive to have a relationship. Your perception that their behaviors or actions are unethical, unjust, and or morally wrong. Cool? If you have any questions at any point, please let me know. Just raise your hand and I will call on you. Okay, so with this starting point, we wanted to understand the antecedents and consequences of consumers' perceived moral inequity. So the first consequence that we discussed in this study is negative affective response, and based on a whole lot of literature review, if you're in comp theory or media theory classes right now, you know that literature reviews are exhaustive, are extensive. So we did a full literature review on negative affective response, and based on that extensive search, we hypothesized that consumers' perceived moral inequity is positively associated with negative affective response. And I'll translate that into English in just a second. So this intuitively makes sense, right? If you think that a relational partner is being unethical, is being morally unjust, you're likely to have a negative affective response to such behavior, which is just a fancy way of saying that you're going to be mad at them, right? That's all it means. Then we also wanted to understand the relational impact of such negative affective response or such, anger at the corporation. So organization-public relationships are a central construct in public relations scholarship, and several studies have demonstrated the negative impact of crises on consumer brand or organization-public relationships. So in this study, we incorporated the conceptualization and operationalization of consumer-corporate brand relationships specifically, rather than organization-public relationships in general. And we hypothesized that customers will report lower relational perceptions after learning of alleged gender discrimination at their favorite companies. And this will make a little bit more sense when I talk about the method section and I show you how we measure all of this. And then, based on prior literature, we also expect that negative affective response will be negatively associated with consumer-corporate relationships. Then, in terms of antecedents of or predictors, which is a less fancy word for antecedents, right? Predictors of perceived moral inequity, we investigated three. Two were related to moral orientation, simply because our variable of interest was moral inequity, perceived moral inequity. So we wanted to understand how moral orientation affected people's perceived moral inequity. And another one related to individuals' inclination toward large corporations or anti-corporate sentiment. So moral orientations capture people's worldview about morality and guides their decision making on determining whether or not an action is moral, right? So moral orientations basically tell you how people decide whether or not something is ethical or moral, right? So there are two broad frameworks or principles of moral orientation that we talk about. First is deontology, which follows Kant's categorical imperative in that an action may be considered moral or immoral regardless of its consequences, right? Did anyone watch The Good Place? Does this sound familiar? Excellent. You all paid attention to The Good Place. I'm very happy. Right, so deontology basically means that it's not the end that matters, it's the action itself, right? So you determine whether or not an action is moral based on not the end, but the means, based on the action itself, the intrinsic quality of the action, not on the result or the end result that it achieved. Make sense? So a deontologist will evaluate the intrinsic characteristics of a behavior to decide whether it is right or wrong, rather than the end result achieved by the action. In contrast, those with consequentialist or utilitarian principles, which draw from something called teleological notions of ethics. I can see all my eyes glazing over right now. Stay with me. Teleological notions of ethics believe in producing the greatest benefit for the individual and society in evaluating something as being moral or ethical. So teleological or consequentialist people believe that it's not the action, but the end that the action achieved should determine whether that action was moral or not. Does that follow? Make sense? Yeah. Okay, so economic consequentialists in particular prioritize the satisfaction of economic goals in determining whether or not an action is ethical or moral, right? So economic consequentialists basically will question, did an action maximize profits? Did an action minimize losses in determining whether that action was morally ethical or not, right? And so we argue that deontologically oriented people will perceive corporate misconduct to be morally wrong or deontologically unethical, regardless of economic gain, whereas economic consequentialists will evaluate an action as moral as long as it produced economic gain, regardless of what the action actually was. Make sense? Excellent. So we predict that the degree of self-reported deontologist orientation will be positively associated with perceived moral inequity, whereas that of economic consequentialist orientation will be negatively associated with perceived moral inequity of corporate behavior. We also predict that anti-corporate sentiment will be positively associated with perceived moral inequity. And finally, we hypothesize that perceived moral inequity will mediate the relationship between the three antecedents and negative affect. When I show you the model, it will make a lot more sense. So this is what the model looks like, right? And I'll show you how we tested all of this. So we conducted a survey among 473 Americans using Qualtrics online panels. If you're not sure what those are, let me know and I'll explain. All the variables were measured and derived from existing research. Some measures, particularly anti-corporate sentiment and consumer brand relationships, required some additional testing, and so I ran EFAs and CFAs, exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis to make sure that the measures were valid. T-tests and structural equation modeling were used for data testing and hypothesis testing. And just so you know, all survey items were measured on a Likert type scale, running from strongly disagree to strongly agree, 1 to 5. Now, this survey was conducted in December 2016, well before the whole Uber situation and the Me Too movement. And so because gender discrimination in the workplace wasn't a burning issue, wasn't a top of the mind issue at the time, we had to simulate the situation, right? And so we asked the participants to choose between one of these 4 companies and specifically select one of which they are a customer, right? So they have to have bought products or customers of Dell, Adidas, Nestle, or Apple, right? So these companies were chosen because they regularly rank pretty highly on lists of highly ethical companies, right? So there aren't too many differences in terms of each of these companies' ethicality, and so they were appropriate for this kind of analysis. Each respondent selected one of these 4 companies, and if they reported not being a customer of any of these 4, they were removed from this analysis altogether, right? Participants then responded to a series of questions about their degree of anti-corporate sentiment, their moral orientation, as well as their perception of their relationship with the brand in question, right? And we programmed the survey so that for each question or for each item, the brand that they chose showed up, right? The name of the brand that they chose was inserted into each of the questions, so that when we asked them about their consumer-corporate brand relationship, they were answering about the brand that they had chosen. Make sense? a short vignette or a short paragraph. And after 45 seconds, they were directed to additional questions related to their reactions to that paragraph. And so this is the paragraph. After shopping, you enter a coffee shop while reading a newspaper over coffee, blah, blah, blah. You come across a news article stating that several global companies have been accused of gender discrimination at the top management level. These companies face the potential of being sued for discriminating against women in employing and promoting them in the corporation's top management. Reporters also unearthed or uncovered significant salary wage gaps between the women and the men in the companies, with men being paid a lot more than the women. In the article, Amnesty International argued that these companies have intentionally discriminated against women to save costs and maximize profits. So, any idea why we included the save costs and maximize profits piece?
Some of them would justify that it's okay because of the consequence.
Exactly. Economic consequentialism, right? This is an indicator or a cue for economic consequentialism. So if people who have who experience or report economic consequentialist moral orientation, for them this would be an indicator that the action would be moral, right? Okay. So the first hypothesis predicted that post-vignette relational perceptions would be lower than pre-vignette relational perceptions. And all four indicators of customer brand relationships, post-vignette perceptions were significantly lower than pre-vignette perceptions, right? Meaning that exposure to allegations of gender discrimination lowered customers' corporate consumer brand relationship perceptions, right, compared to pre-exposure levels. To test the hypotheses, I used structural equation modeling, but because a mediation was hypothesized, that had to be tested first. I used something called Holmdyke's mediation testing procedure, wherein you generally test three models. The first model that is tested does not contain the mediator at all. The second model contains full mediation, and the third model that is tested is a partial mediation, and whichever one has the best fit, goodness of fit indices, is retained. And so the partial mediation model that you see here had the best fit and therefore was retained for analysis. And as you can see from these tiny numbers, all the hypotheses that we had were supported. Economic consequentialist orientation reduced customers' perception of moral inequity, right? Whereas deontological orientation was positively associated with moral inequity, as was anti-corporate sentiment. Moral inequity was strongly associated with negative affect, right? So if you perceive a company's actions to be morally unethical, morally wrong, you're likely to be mad about it. It's really that simple, right? And then that anger manifested in the form of lower consumer brand relationships, right? And so this study has a variety of different theoretical contributions. First, this was one of the first studies to conceptualize the idea of perceived moral inequity, right? And provide a theoretically grounded model that explained consumers' perceived moral inequity. A lot of communication scholarship actually tends to focus on public's reactions to companies' crisis responses rather than the crisis itself, right? So think about this. Most of what we study tends to be, because we're all communication researchers, right? We tend to focus on, all right, the company made a response, we wrote out a particular type of crisis response, how do people respond to it? Not a lot of research focuses on how consumers, customers respond to allegations in the moment, which is what this particular study did. And this was also one of the first studies to unpack consumers' responses to workplace gender discrimination. And given cases like Uber, as well as the aftermath of the Me Too movement, there does need to be a lot more attention from scholarship on these kinds of issues and understanding how we can either mitigate the reactions to gender discrimination, as well as how we can convince our bosses, the people in top positions to say, hey, there is going to be a negative impact if you keep engaging in corporate misconduct. If you keep engaging in bad behaviors, there will be consequences, right? So this study helps do that. And of course, there are limitations. This is not an experiment. This is just a survey. We don't even call it a quasi-experiment. There was no control group. There was no random assignment. There were no conditions. There was just a one vignette. It was just before and after. All the brands that we used actually have pretty strong reputations. And so that is another thing that future studies might want to test for. And we only focused on one particular issue, right? One particular type of misconduct, which was gender discrimination in the workplace. And so there are a variety of different questions and investigations that should and will spawn off of this kind of research, right? And basically, we're trying to help companies become more ethical, right? More moral in their actions, in their behaviors, and make sure that their actions are commensurate with their values, right? So in this next study that I'll be talking to you all about, we try to address some of the limitations that I just mentioned and really investigate whether the concept of perceived moral inequity holds up in other kinds of misconduct and in different cultural contexts. So this article is titled Understanding Customers' Reactions to Allegations of Corporate Environmental Irresponsibility. And this was published last year in a journal called Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, if you're interested in reading it. The previous article I talked about was on workplace gender discrimination, whereas this one is based on allegations of environmental misconduct. This project was actually based in Australia, and I'll explain why in a little bit. So the purpose of this study was to examine issue-specific and organization-specific factors that affect how customers react to allegations of irresponsibility, environmental irresponsibility from their favorite companies. So as I'm sure you know, in the past few years, we have seen several instances of corporations acting irresponsibly and in several cases also illegally. In particular, as climate change continues to have its effect across the world, the pressure on our natural resources is increasing, especially on potable water, right? Water that can be drunk. In Australia especially, water shortages are a mounting crisis to which both organizations, corporations, and the government need to pay attention. Unfortunately, the water crisis around the world is actually being exacerbated by a practice called illegal dumping. Has anyone heard of this? Illegal dumping? It's a practice where corporations dispose of toxic chemicals, not safely like they're supposed to, but instead just dump toxic chemicals into water streams, into river waters, into water sources that support and provide water to people, to humans, to ecosystems, right? That process then ends up damaging, increasing instances of cancer in some cases, and we've seen this kind of behavior in the US, in Australia, in various countries in Africa, etc., right? And so in this particular study, we wanted to understand the issue and organization-specific factors that influence how customers react to such allegations, right? So first we start with the cognitive and behavioral outcomes that customers may report when learning of such corporate misconduct. So the previous study I talked about was centered on the concept of perceived moral inequity. And we saw how perceived moral inequity impacted customers' affective responses, which then lowered their relational perceptions with the organization. And since then, since that particular article was published, a number of other studies have demonstrated the value of perceived moral inequity as a cognitive response to corporate misconduct. Perceived moral inequity has also been found to impact public's behavioral responses, which is what we wanted to study in this particular project. Specifically, we studied customers' intentions to boycott the brand, boycott the company in light of the misconduct. And do we all understand boycotts, right? Where customers deliberately choose not to purchase products from a company again and say, I will never buy from XYZ company ever again, they are unethical, right? Or customers engage in something called a boycott. Has anyone heard of that term before? A boycott, B-U-Y-C-O-T-T, right up there. So a boycott refers to deliberate purchasing behaviors from customers toward a company in order to show their support for a company, right? And so studies have shown that perceived moral inequity increases boycotting and decreases boycotting behaviors, right? Makes sense? Pretty intuitive. Then we looked at organization-specific factors. To understand organization-specific factors, we turned to something called identification literature. Because identity and identification are not really constructs that we study a whole lot in public relations. Specifically, we were interested in the idea of brand identity fusion. Brand identity fusion is a concept that draws from the idea of identity fusion, which a group of social psychologists called Swan, Gomez, Sale, Morales, and Tweety, they explained that when an individual's membership or alignment with a social group or a collective becomes so powerful and personal that their self-identity becomes closely tied with the identity of the group, right? And so they use this concept to explain extremist behavior, right? Extremist behavior on behalf of a group. And so when people experience identity fusion, they seem to care more about the outcomes of the group than they do about their own, right? It's a visceral feeling of oneness. It is, so identity fusion is a concept that is related to identification, but it's not the same. And more importantly, highly fused individuals are motivated to endorse the group regardless of the group's actions, right? So highly fused people will tend to justify the group's actions regardless of what the group did, right? The group's identity is so closely tied to their own that any damage to the group would damage the individual's self-identity, motivating highly fused individuals to sort of rationalize and justify the group's actions. And so this idea, the idea of identity fusion, was applied to brands. And so Lin and Sung, who are two scholars in management, tested this idea to apply to customer-brand relationships and posited that the idea of brand identity fusion. And they said that highly fused customers who experience identity fusion with the brand, experience a visceral feeling of oneness with the brand to the extent that they may be willing to overlook transgressions perpetrated by the brand because such transgressions, allegations would threaten the customer's self-identity, right? So what we can gather from this is that brand identity fusion would likely lower customers' negative reactions to allegations of misconduct and possibly trigger supporting behaviors in order for them to maintain and preserve their identities that are so intrinsically linked and tied to the brand, right? Now remember, we also, this particular study was related to environmental irresponsibility. So we wanted to understand how people's feelings toward environmental protection as a social issue might impact their reactions to these allegations. So the central argument is that your reactions to corporate misconduct are likely to be influenced by how you feel about your company, whether you identify with the company or whether you experience brand identity fusion. These are organization-specific factors, as well as how you feel about the social issue about which the corporate misconduct has been committed. In this study, the misconduct was related to environmental irresponsibility. So your attitudes toward environmental protection and how motivated you are about the environment as a social issue, will likely influence how you react to allegations of environmental irresponsibility. And so what we were trying to understand in this study was whether your attachment to the company, your brand identity fusion, would be more powerful than how you feel about the environment, the social issue that they've exacerbated or caused, right? Customers who are motivated about environmental protection as an issue would likely not be happy with these allegations, right? If you care about the environment, you're going to be pretty upset with this company that has been that against which there are allegations. And I'll show you a hypothesis soon. We also posited that issue-specific attitudes also influence the extent to which individuals will be motivated about the environment as an issue. And so these are all the hypotheses that we posited. Very importantly, the ones I want to point out is that we posited that degree of brand identity fusion will lower perceived moral inequity, right? Degree of brand identity fusion will lower boycott intentions and increase boycott intentions. So basically what we're trying to test is after being exposed to allegations of environmental irresponsibility, customers who experience brand identity fusion will be less likely to report wanting to boycott the company and more likely to want to buy more from the company in spite of the allegations. Yeah? Okay. So to test these hypotheses, we conducted surveys using Qualtrics online panels again. A total of 525 Australian citizens responded to the survey. Australia was chosen as the location of the survey because of its susceptibility to climate change, as well as mounting water shortages that are happening in Australia. There were quotas for age and gender to ensure that the sample was representative of the population of Australia. Again, at the beginning of the survey, respondents were asked if they owned a smartphone, a cell phone, and if yes, they were asked to indicate the brand of cell phone or smartphone that they use, like Apple, Samsung, HTC, as well as several local brands. Those who did not own a cell phone, there weren't too many people who did not own a cell phone, but those who did not were eliminated from this survey. The respondents then asked a series of questions about their perceptions of their relationship with the cell phone brand, as well as the degree of their brand identity fusion with the cell phone brand that they use. We chose cell phone brands for a very specific reason. Cell phones are pretty ubiquitous in Australia. 91% of the adult population in Australia uses a cell phone, especially a smartphone, right? Which means they're pretty ubiquitous. Cell phones or smartphone companies, although you only buy a cell phone every 3 years, most smartphone companies also produce additional products. How many of you have the AirPods? Right? How many of you own an Apple Watch? How many of you own a Samsung watch? Not too many, okay. How many of you bought a Mac because you had an iPhone to start with and therefore it was just more Yep, see? Yep. Right. And so when you start with one product, you sort of build into the network of those products, right? And that's why the cell phone industry was really good for testing this. Additionally, because there is a lot of fandom associated with cell phones, particularly iPhones, right? Particularly with Apple. Would any of you who own iPhones consider switching to Android? I rest my case, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so we asked about their brand identity fusion, we asked about their attitudes towards environmental protection, etc., and then they were asked to read this vignette. Several global companies have reportedly been disposing of toxic waste from their production facilities in Australia into clean water sources such as streams, rivers, lakes. Tens of thousands of Australians have been exposed to toxic waste, potential risks including cancer, etc. One of the companies accused of unsafe toxic water waste disposal is blank, right? So if somebody chose Apple, that would say Apple. If somebody chose Samsung, that would say Samsung, right? About 34% of the participants reported using Apple, 33% reported using Samsung, which is pretty much in line with the distribution of brands in Australia. Okay, so after this vignette, we asked the participants about their perceived moral inequity. We asked them how they evaluated the action. We asked them about their boycott or boycott intentions toward the organization. You're not interested in this, but I'll tell you anyway. We analyzed the data using Stata IC14. Before any of the analyses, we tested for reliability. Convas alpha was good. SEM was used, again, structural equation modeling, blah, blah, blah. The structural model had good fit, so we continued with the analysis. And so this is what the final model looked like, right? And I want to draw your attention to two things. Identity fusion to moral inequity, and you can't really see because I'm standing in front of it, but identity fusion lowered people's evaluation of the action being morally wrong. Identity fusion increased their intentions of buying more from the company in spite of these allegations, right? That's a pretty interesting and important finding. Basically, what we found was that brand identity fusion can act as a relational shield for companies when they're facing allegations of corporate misconduct. Now, this is not to say that, yes, companies should go ahead and do corporate misconduct because identity fusion will save them. No, obviously that's not what the point is. But when eventually companies face a crisis, whether or not they are actually responsible for the crisis, brand identity fusion can be something that will help them weather the crisis. Make sense? So now I won't talk to you too much about the theoretical findings and the limitations, because you all know all of that for the most part. But what I want to stress is the idea of brand identity fusion as a relational shield in the face of allegations of misconduct. And so now the obvious question is, how do we do that? How do we increase customers' brand identity fusion? Right? That's an obvious question. I'm glad you're asking that question, because the next study that I'm going to talk to you all about, and very quickly because I still want to leave some time for questions, is this next study, exploring the dynamics between brand investment, customer investment, brand identification, and brand identity fusion. So again, in this study, we wanted to understand what factors influence customers' brand identity fusion. This article was published actually just last month in a journal called Journal of Business Research. It's a management journal. And in this study, like I said, we explored how relationship investment, both from the customer as well as from the brand, impacts customers' perceptions of identification with the brand and brand identity fusion with the company. And so relationships, like I said, are a central construct in public relations literature. A lot of research has focused on how organizations can build and maintain high-quality relationships with their publics, including customers. But one thing we don't really talk too much about in PR literature, in PR scholarship, is the idea of relationship investment, which refers to any resources that are put into the relationship by each relationship partner, right? So you as individuals, as customers, when you experience a relationship with an organization, do put in some resources. And there are different types of resources that you will put in. Similarly, an organization will put in resources into developing a relationship with you. And you will perceive that a company or a relational partner puts in certain kinds of resources. So your own investment is called customer investment, POI, perceived own investment. Your perception of your relational partner's investment is called PPI. I know it's a whole lot of terminology, but it will become clearer in just a second. And so let's talk specifically about POI or customer investment. POI or customer investment contains two types of resources that are invested. First is intrinsic investment or investment of direct, tangible resources like time, money, effort to go buy the product, etc. Second is extrinsic investment, which involves the investment of extraneous resources like memories, shared identity, with other users of the same product. Personal identity. So how many of you have stood in line to buy the latest iPhone? How many of you know of people who have done that? Right. So standing in line to buy an iPhone is intrinsic investment, right? You're standing in line, you're spending time, you're spending money, you're spending energy to buy the product, right? When you buy the iPhone and you have it and you take a selfie with the box and you post it, that's a social interaction, right? You're doing that to show people that you have the new iPhone. That's extrinsic investment, right? Or think about this. Have you watched videos of like parents gifting their children their first ever iPhones, right? Surprising people with iPhones. Those are memories. Memories people are building, associating with a particular product or a brand because that brand is special, right? That memory building is an extrinsic investment, right? So there are two types of personal or own investment or customer investment, extrinsic and intrinsic. Similarly, there are also two types of perceived partner investment or brand investment. So brand economic investment refers to all the resources that a brand puts into the relationship to build you good products, to bring you new products, to launch new products, to do research, to give you discounts. Basically, any investment into building a functional relationship with customers is brand economic investment. Brand social investment refers to any efforts that a brand makes to build an emotional connection with you, with their customers, right? So a few years ago when iPhone X10, is it called 10 or X? Whichever the last iPhone was launched, they did this whole campaign where they wanted you all to share your best photo or taken on an iPhone. Do you remember that campaign? It was a full-fledged campaign. There was a huge social campaign behind it. There were lots of activations around it. Those kinds of investments into building a social connection with customers is brand social investment, right? But not a lot is known about the connection between customers' perceptions of their own two types of investment and their perceptions of brands' investment into the relationship. So drawing on something called social exchange theory and the principle of reciprocity, we hypothesize that customers' perception of a brand making economic investment into the relationship will trigger their intrinsic investment, right? Investment of money, time, effort, whereas perception of social investment from a brand will trigger customers' extrinsic investment. And all four of these will then trigger their brand identification, which will also trigger brand identity fusion. Now for this study, we use the same data set as the previous data set, Australians, 525 people, quotas for age and gender, using Qualtrics online panels, and these were the results. And so what we found was that yes, investment does have an effect on identification and identity fusion, but only one type, right? As you can see here, customer extrinsic investment has a direct positive effect on identification as well as brand identity fusion, right? Direct positive effect of customer extrinsic investment on identity fusion. Similarly, perceived social investment has a positive direct effect on brand identity fusion as well, not on identification, I guess, but the others too, right? Similarly, similar types of brand investment trigger similar types of customer investment, right? Okay. So the basic idea behind this is that if you want your customers to be loyal advocates of your organization, if you want them to be megaphones on your behalf, ambassadors on your behalf, if you want them to experience identity fusion, you need to make social investments into your relationship with your customers. That's the central idea from this study. Okay, do we have time? We barely have time, but I'll tell you in just one quick minute, this last study, I didn't even create slides for it, I just have this one model. Basically, in this study, I proposed the organization identity fusion, right? So in the previous studies, we examined the relationship between customers and brands. In this one, we're talking about employee organization identity fusion and how that can impact job engagement, right? So I'll stop here for now and open it up for your questions.
I'm just curious, it's a fascinating area and I don't know a lot about it, Dr. Krishna. Tell me a little bit about what's your next research.
So for, this particular study is something that was funded by Questum actually, and in this one, yes, I was quite pleased with that. But so in this one, we actually so remember the two vignettes that I showed you. For this study, I designed two more vignettes. One of them alleged discrimination in the workplace based on race, perpetrated by the company in general, and the other one talked about racial discrimination by the CEO. So at that time, Papa John's was a thing, right? That whole situation was happening. So the next study actually looks like how identity fusion lowers or increases job turnover intentions as a result of those allegations. So that's another study that I'm working on. Another study that I'm working on is looks at political identity fusion, which as soon as I say it, I'm sure most of you are like, oh yeah, that's a thing, unfortunately. And so that's another piece of stream of research that I'm going to be looking at coming out of this work. Lily.
Do you find any differences in brand identity fusion between like the different brands like Apple versus like Dell?
That's a great question. We didn't really test that granularly simply because most people just chose Apple. So we didn't have a sample size in that study. In this one, we had Samsung versus Apple, and there weren't really differences between identity fusion reported for both, which is surprising. I thought people who are Apple users would be more, Apple. I'm not an Apple user, clearly, so. my biases sort of show in this research. No research is biased for you guys. Oh, I shouldn't be sitting because I'm right on camera.
Hi, so, well, thank you for the I also have a question about your first study.
Mhm.
So with the 4 brands, you chose to eliminate the people that
Did not
did not use any of that. And so one, I was wondering, like, do you remember the statistics? Is it like how many people were actually like not using it?
Yep, yep. So the question was, oh, sorry.
Oh, and then just a follow-up from that
Yeah.
was, I was thinking, wouldn't it have been interesting to include them because they would contribute to the as a corporate sentiment
Yep.
group?
Yep. So that's a great question, Anna. So the question is, in the first study that I showed you guys, where people had to choose between Dell, Nestle, Apple, or Adidas, I think, one of those 4, I eliminated people who did not use any of those brands, right? And why we did so? Because it would be interesting because they might also have anti-corporate sentiment. So we actually collected 2 sets of data. One set of data contained customers or users, and another data set contained non-users. And so for that data set, we did the same thing, and we published a few articles related to people who were non-consumers and their reactions to the allegations of irresponsibility or gender discrimination. With the cell phone thing, there were so few people that did not have cell phones that we couldn't get that many people. So, yeah. But great question, thank you. Destiny.
So will there ever be a chance when there's not really any negative press or SEO about a company and they're also making really high investments, but they still get like a bad rep with their kind of customers, but they're not really seeing buyouts and stuff like that? Like what do you base that kind of behavior on then?
Say that again, sorry, Destiny.
So pretty much you're doing everything right, like you don't have any bad perceptions or media about you.
No, not necessarily. This just says that there are associations between, so when we do research, we're looking at means, right, and how things correlate to each other. That does not mean that there aren't any boycott intentions. There are. It's just we're looking at people who intended to boycott, not boycott,
Oh, okay.
right? So both exist. This is a continuum. It's not a 1 or 0. Yeah? Yeah. What else can I tell you? Are you interested in the vaccine-related research? I can tell you about that if you want, or bore you some more. So Dr. Amazine and I are actually working on a project to correct vaccine misinformation. And so if you, that particular project is centered on the idea that a lot of vaccine misinformation is spread in the form of narratives, right? In the form of stories on Facebook without much scientific evidence, right? They're spread in the form of anecdotes, right? XYZ son's father's grandson got the MMR shot, the light immediately went out of their eyes, and they became autistic almost immediately, right? It's called the overnight autism story, right? And so in this one project, we were testing different strategies that are narrative-based to correct or at least refute the original story. So there's a Facebook post, and there's a comment that contains the refutation or the narrative counter. So that's a project that Dr. Amazine and I are working on. Similarly, we're working on a project on the COVID-19 vaccine as well. Yes.
Her friend's cousin.
Her cousin's friend's body parts becoming swollen. I'm on camera. So that kind of misinformation, again, it's spread in the form of narratives. It's spread in the form of anecdotes. And so how do you counter those anecdotes, right? Because they may have happened, but they may be one-offs. So that's important to acknowledge. And so that's something that Dr. Amazine and I are looking to correct. So watch out for that. I have another study that just got published about that talks about a typology of disinformation susceptibility. So who is susceptible to disinformation? So if you're interested in that topic, let me know. I will send you the article and you can read it if you like. I will definitely send it.
Well, I think that's about right about at 4:30. So Dr. Krishna, thank you so much.
Absolutely.